I'm going to stand to do this. I'm an inveterate wanderer, so I apologise. There's a number of themes that have been picked up on, and it's unfortunate that our geographer's not here, because I'm going to talk about space to some point, space, land, and the sacralisation of land. I'm going to pick up on themes of nativism, populism, and anti-elitism, and look at how they begin to converge. I'm here as kind of an interloper because there's a strong religious studies field, and I'm coming to this from a kind of sociological approach, but I'm not a good sociologist. My background's cultural studies, and I've washed up in sociology. And I'm trying to work through some ideas from some research that I did last year, but it seemed to be quite dense in terms of what I'm trying to work through is the locatedness, if you like, the locatedness of a translocal white nationalism. That we're familiar with the idea of nationalisms which are rooted in a particular space. But what we're seeing emerging, particularly with the marginalisation, or what had been the marginalisation of radical right-wing politics, that there was a coming together, an international coming together of nationalists, but in an international setting. So this is what I'm beginning to sort through. And I apologise, I realised about 11 o'clock last night that my slides are possibly going to be relatively illegible. Where I started with this was after or during the IS attacks on Paris in November 2015. It's part of ongoing research into nationalism and the identity of white nationalists. I was monitoring Stormfront, which is a web forum which is dedicated to white nationalism. And I tracked the talk, white nationalist talk, discourse around the attacks on Paris. And what I noticed very, very rapidly was out of about 2,000 messages that were swapped on this theme, two themes emerged very quickly. Message number 6 in this 2,000 message conversation, message number 6 said, just as news was breaking, this isn't IS, the Jews are behind this. It's a Jewish conspiracy. Very, very rapidly, we veered into anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. But what was also quite interesting was, at the same time, this Jewish conspiracy was concerned with the idea of a coming or an already existing race war. Now, the title which I maybe put forward, I think included the phrase #white genocide, which was a tactical Twitter tag that elements of the white nationalist community began to circulate and had already been in use, but this was seen, the attacks were seen as a key opportunity for this to gain further traction in social media. And it's this convergence of conspiracy and apocalypse, the idea of the end of a particular way of understanding whiteness, which began to inform what I'm looking at. Because what we're looking at it's a political entity, straightforwardly. It is the far right. Neo-Fascism, Neo-Nazism, there are boundary disputes around exactly what we're discussing here. But so much of the language, so much of the imagery, so many of the ideas are actually religious in nature. They're founded in a particular way of thinking about the people united in a particular way. And I'm not necessarily talking about something particularly new, conceptually. I mean, there's been commentary on this, especially in the context of millennialism and white nationalist narratives. Barkun on improvisational millennialism provides some kind of conceptual space. Clark and Boas, wonderful term, conspirituality, the coming together of conspiracy theory and spirituality as a way of thinking through these themes. But particularly in the field of white nationalism, there's a lot of material already extant discussing that spiritual component, that spiritual part of white nationalism. So is this actually nationalism? Is this nationalism as we might understand there's this call to a national people? Well, to some extent, yes. And this idea of nationalism as a form of religious expression, in that broadest definition of religion, religiosity, I suppose, as opposed to any kind of institutionalized form of religion, it's not something that's unusual in the literature of nationalism. So Ernest Gellner, I think, relatively well-known work, said, in a nationalist age, societies worship themselves brazenly and openly, spurning the camouflage. It's the worship of a people for themselves, their values, that idea of the folk. Anthony Smith articulates, particularly, I guess, and this is where we get into this kind of area of geography and the idea of space, and he makes a link between the idea of the people and the land. And he says, a sacred territory that belonged historically to a particular community and is therefore sanctified by the association. It's that act of sanctification of land, of that spatial relationship between identity and land. And I think these are captured quite nicely. Now, this is the revisiting of, I suppose, an idea that had faded temporarily from currency. And this is Berger's idea of nomos, and the idea of a sacred canopy that binds people together with a particular idea of homeland. And it's been reused recently by Roger Griffin, who's written extensively on fascism, and I think it's probably best known for his work on fascism, but he's written about terrorism more recently, and the kind of fanaticism that drives a people toward the kind of the violent solution to whatever problem that they read within the world. And Griffin puts this nicely, I think. He says, the ultimate roots of fanaticism lie not just in material exigencies, I couldn't pronounce that, but overwhelmingly in the species-defining capacity to create a set of mythic beliefs that furnish a sense of identity and purpose, a nomos, and then to defend or assert that nomos to the death for reasons that extend far beyond the realm of practical considerations. And this begins to approach the territory that I'm suggesting is being carved out by white nationalists. It's the invention of a new a sense of shared conceptual space, which affirms their identity as a bounded community. So whilst a lot of Stormfront and much of the literature in the radical right talks of white nationalism, other terms become available because it's not straightforwardly nationalism. There are elements of populism, this kind of anti-elitist stance that begun hearing described in David's paper, but also combined with an authoritarianism, which is at least one strand of the appeal of Trump, but particularly nativism. And it's the idea of nativism, this connection of a fundamental connection of a people that I think I'm trying to work through. And whilst there are different iterations within the radical right, a common core begins to emerge that's shared by all of them. This is ethno-nationalism, a particular idea of a nationalism bounded by ethnic identity. And this becomes quite important when we dislocate it from the territory, so to speak. Anti-elitism, and of course the idea that the community's interests are absolutely paramount in terms of what they do. And there's the beginning of a literature in this area. The idea of a translocal nationalism, looking at a form of nationalism, a form of what I suppose was once called nationalism, that exists in multiple separate and discrete territories, but which increasingly begin to be unified and facilitated through the use of the internet. And so this common core that I described earlier is bound together by what Hogan and Holtiner call, which I quite like, a right-wing populist playbook, which allows the cross-fertilisation of ideas and rhetoric. And it's this cross-fertilisation of ideas and rhetoric which is, I suppose, the jumping-off point for the next piece of work that I begin to do, which is looking at how the alt-right incorporates, now whether it's purposively or not, but incorporate narratives from the far right. And it's that blending and merging of the alt and the far right that I think is going to inform where this work goes. But I've got a paper to get out of this at some point. So these are ideas in process. So what I'm looking at really is I'm exploring the characteristics through which we can identify the nomos that's being appealed to by the contemporary or the current far right, and the current far right as an international concern in communication and in knowing communication through different transnational locations. So, starting point. This is somewhere that I turn to it's about 4 or 5 years ago, looking at a website called Mourning the Ancients. What I was quite interested in this website, there's a purposeful strategy of attracting people into the ideas of white nationalism. It sets itself up as a music fan site. So people can go there, typically underground variations on underground heavy metal. So you go there, you read about your local, your favourite band, and you accidentally come across, this is their intention, on the one hand, a lot of very dodgy right-wing writings. There's a Savitri Devi they seem to be quite into on, in various bits they talk about. And also a lot of, and forgive me, I'm going to look at some examples of this because it still staggers me, essentially right-wing soft porn. It's a bizarre site, but it's the use of symbols, it's the coming together of multiple signifieds of the ideas of a heritage that's being spoken to through the site, the ancient that's being mourned. There's a kind of this mournfulness ties into the idea of white genocide and the passing of the white race. And this, in no small part, is due to the influence of David Lane, who came up with the idea of the so-called 14 words, which were, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. So we're back to children again, as something that's been mentioned previously. But it's the idea of the boundedness and a shared spiritual destiny within the so-called white race. It's got clearly a problematic concept. But they set themselves out as a fearless magazine for the true underground. But what I find interesting is the symbolic mapping of what constitutes white nationalism here. We've got a few examples. And there's an attempt to create or construct a neo-fascist archetype or series of neo-fascist archetypes through repeatedly using the same model. Perhaps it was the only photogenic far-right female they could find. I don't know. I speculate at this point. But here she is in a variety of different guises with lots of variations on the swastika decorating her and the backdrop. We have the use of the sun, the idea of the primordial forest, which is superimposed on her face, and she becomes part of a swastika here. But then we have much more, I guess, rooted, concrete. Believe me, I've spared you a great deal in my selection of these images. So I apologise for the encroachment of... Well, she's got a blindfold on, this justice. And the blindfold is a coming together of the Star of David and the eye in the pyramid of the Illuminati. And we begin to see the emergence of anti-Semitic themes in what they're doing. And of course the Confederate flag, which has been much contested recently in North America, this becomes part of their iconography. And it's not straightforwardly nationalist. Yeah, they're an American side, and yes, they use familiar American symbols, but they also use Greek symbols, Germanic symbols, and it's this convergence of symbols of nationalism that I begin to suggest is the mapping out of a shared sense of nomos amongst white nationalists. Now, there's a lot of authorial intent there. We're being guided by the editors. So the next piece of work that I did was concerned with, well, what do white nationalists en masse, how do they identify, how do they organise these symbols? The way in which I began to do this was looking at the use of avatars in Stormfront. Now, avatars are these little symbols by which people sum up their individual identity, but also it's their membership of the collective identity. They project into the communal membership how they fit, how they see themselves as fitting this communal membership. So, on every post that somebody uses, we've got an avatar. And I collected, I don't know, 400 or 500 of these. I've got fed up, I have to confess, of looking at these after a while. And you see some examples here. They, for the most part, what we may imagine is there's kind of a... I'm going to rush through this. Lots of Germanic symbols, white nationalist symbols. Yoda was a surprising one, I have to say. Anyway, what I became quite interested in was, yeah, we've got these images, but we've also got a lot of talk. How can I integrate? Well, essentially what I wanted to do is produce a multimodal ideological discourse analysis of seeing how those images and the words, the discourse of the forum fitted together. And I used, and I'm not going to, it's only 5 minutes left, so I won't go into the methodology. Basically, I used latent Dirichlet allocation, which was just looking for how themes emerge in the 28,000 odd messages that I analysed for this, to get a good feel of the discursive field. And so what I was able to do was to begin to organise the avatars into the themes that came out of the text analysis, quite in-depth text mining. So there's ideas of whiteness, Germanic history, American identity, Nazism, and that's historical and neo-Nazism, and ideas of strength around protection and unity. Lots of these crossed over between boundaries. I'll use this, the Black Sun, Aryan myth and Nazism, Texas 1488, 14 referring to David Lane's 14 words, 88 HH, Heil Hitler's, and this splits between different categories, Aryan myth, Americanism and Nazism, both historical and modern. Other themes emerged which lay outside of the text analysis. Landscape, particularly landscape, and also in animals. Neo-Nazis like a lot of fluffy white bunnies. I don't have an answer for this. I can't fit this into my analysis. However, that emergence of landscape and the idea of a sacred homeland under threat from this Jewish conspiracy is not really surprising in the context we're looking at. And I began to drill down into particular categories, these topics that emerged from the text analysis. And in the Aryan myth section, we can see these recurring patterns. At once, there's an appeal to an idealised past, which may or may not ever have existed. But there's also a combination of quite other interesting things, which some of the literature's touched upon. So we've got Lord of the Rings and mythic fantasy as a recurring theme, and I've forgotten the first name. Crossley has written about the use of the Lord of the Rings trilogy by the EDL, I think, quite interestingly. Nordic paganism, runes, Yggdrasil, which we have in the grounds here, all often combined with 14 and this idea of David Lane. David Lane produced a very apocalyptic Wotanism. Sorry, I was distracted. And this has been commented on to some extent. Also, the idea of green man and eco-folklore, primordial homelands, and radical traditionalists. And Amy Hale's written about this, particularly in the works of John Michel. And we see together there the blurring of the boundaries between the far right and a typically more, I suppose, what would be associated with the left wing. And this is what I begin to suggest, that these symbols, by their use, by their appropriation by the far right, they take on a symbolic power in context outside of their forums. And this is at least part of, I suppose, the strategy that's being used quite purposefully within the far right. This is the penultimate slide, so I'm getting there. But what we end up is a kind of a bricolage religion. And we can see in this one very small subset of the avatars, there's kind of like a semiotic chain at work here, which begins to link together different ideas and different concepts under that spiritual canopy that the white nationalists are increasingly beginning to claim as their own. And this is quite a purposive use of religious imagery and the carving out of a niche for a community that prior to the internet, prior to the facilitation of these translocal nationalisms, simply didn't exist. There had been communication between different iterations of the far right, but the idea of the far right coming together as a self-consciously transnational entity is a relatively new thing. So what I'm suggesting is that what we're seeing is the emergence of a mapping out of a particular form of white nationalist spirituality. We can ignore the small print. And this is not really a conclusion, it's more of a kind of a reminder to myself as to why I'm doing this. But this is if what we're seeing within white nationalism is a kind of a spiritual basis for what they do, a sacralizing of the idea of race now, and this is something that has happened historically, but we're seeing a very conscious turn towards that within the far right. And Stormfront, where I'm describing this, isn't a small website. It's got something like 1 million individual visitors every month. So it's quite a well-visited and well-travelled path that I'm describing here. But if we are to counter the far right, we should, I think, treat it not straightforwardly as a political entity, but a spiritual political entity with a very clear and clearly defined sense of history as something that is unfolding currently and working towards a particular, eschaton, for want of a better phrase, or an endpoint, and that is the coming of a race war. And it's that adds drama to the moment, because we see it in the actions of people like Thomas Mayer or Anders Breivik, who see themselves as fighting in this race war. So, I think we've seen a positive response from the British state in treating Thomas Mayer as a terrorist, a far-right terrorist, as opposed to somebody who could be pathologised and therefore explained away. But to treat the terrorist impulse present within the far right as straightforwardly political, I think, is to miss the dimension that hopefully I'm beginning to show is a current and ongoing concern of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew didn't give me a chance to introduce him. He's
sorry.
Andrew Wilson, Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the University of Derby. Do we have questions for Andrew? Yes. And I'll come to you next, David.
Thank you. That was tremendously exciting to listen to. It reminded me of Apodurai's cultural landscapes. So you have the idea of ethnoscapes. So the one bit of hope I had from that is that the far right is becoming a marginalised diaspora globally.
Sure.
Hurrah! That would be lovely. But again, it's the compression of time and the looking for a past narrative. But there's also the flip side of that. You've got groups like urban intellectuals and various black racially motivated organisations that are springing up, and the common link between them seems to be the lack of historical accuracy and academic content in lots of them. And I hate to say it, but it seems to be true. And it's a fear of mixing of race. So this idea of race being tied to land and sacred space just is biblical as well, but is very current. And thank you. There's so much to go on that.
Well, thanks. I think the way in which I frame an understanding of these processes, and indeed what you describe, and I think also a great deal of what David was touching on, the idea of conspiracy theories based on the idea of the New World Order, is, for want of a better phrase, kind of a cultural lag behind the onset of globalization, that we don't have the conceptual vocabularies, we don't have the cultural vocabularies to understand the interconnectedness that globalization is increasingly forcing us to be aware of.
And that's what provides me with that glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
We're in early stages.
We are in early stages, and I think we're seeing something of, it is a reactionary politics, and it is a reaction to an increased internationalism. Conversely, of course, the technologies that facilitate this actually allow these otherwise disparate groups to form a sense of shared destiny. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Andrew. Really good. I wondered if you've come across Red Ice Radio. Are you aware of these guys?
No, I'm not. Please tell me more.
So they're based in Sweden. It started off as one guy with I think he produces 2 sort of podcasts a week. And recently they've been developing a lot more. The guy who does it is very media savvy, so it's got very high production values. And it's it's produced in Sweden, but it's in English, so it's got quite a wide audience. What I thought might be of interest to you is that when I started following them, when I was doing most of my research for the doctoral project, I started following them in 2012. And at that point, there was some conspiracy material, but most of it was kind of esoteric, pagan, kind of new age field. And over the last 5 years, there's been a complete shift from that through paganism into open anti-Semitism, World War II, questioning the Holocaust, all that kind of stuff, and just open anti-Semitism. It's quite an astonishing a transformation, but I think not an untypical one. It's just very unusual that we have that data there. But a lot of the images that you were talking about, you can actually see a progression, a semantic drift from the left nature worship through that into the idea of folk, and then slowly into far right politics.
I mean, there's a comparable progression at work in green anarchism in this country. And Green Anarchist magazine from mid to late 80s, I think. That same discernible shift of that feeling of connection to a broad sense of the earth, but then it becomes particularized and localized, and the boundaries begin to emerge around exactly who the land belongs to. It may belong to all of us initially, but there's that sense of a particularized local understanding, and that is where the seeds, and this is what my final sentence is about, prevent it taking root, the homeland must be pulled from beneath its feet. It's the idea of once there is that sense of a connection between a people and a soil, then that's when we begin to, and yes, I suppose if part of the implication of what I'm talking about is the very idea of nation itself is problematic, but that's a bigger argument, I think, and I hope for another day.
Well, this has almost gone in the other direction, though, because he initially gives a sacred importance to white people in Sweden, but from that, he gets involved in nationalistic discourse, forms connection with American kind of libertarian groups, and is now much more of this sort of transnational topos, popular topos, or whatever the word, nomos that you used earlier on. So it's almost that it comes from the specific into a much more universal white genocide rather than Swedish genocide.
And I think that is that note of concern, that it becomes translocal, that it transcends the idea of the local and becomes an international concern. And I think the next phase that, as I said, I want to look at is how narratives from within the far right get picked up on in the alt-right, and how they're used in conjunction with more mainstream ideas such as clash of civilizations, how this becomes part of a very dangerous politics that is becoming increasingly centre ground.
Yeah. But you should definitely check them out.
I will do.
Specifically alt-right connections as well.
Rujana, come over, and then Susan.
I come from Iran, and of course Iran means land of the Aryans, and we're the true Aryans. But a serious point is that it might surprise you to learn that exactly the same sort of phenomenon is happening in Iran. You might think that the Islamic Revolution would have led to an obliteration of Iran's ethnic identity and a submergence into this sort of Islamic Arab identity. But in fact, exactly the opposite has occurred. There's a huge movement in Iran to purify the Persian language from Arabic words. So in other words, de-Islam is de-Islamicating the Iranian language. There's a huge movement of sort of trying to, and this is sort of within the mainstream. I don't talk about marginal groups. These are the intellectuals, the sort of leaders of thought in Iran, and also a trying to sort of get back to the Zoroastrian roots of Iranian culture. All of these sorts of things are very much, I mean, it's not something I've studied, so I can't really say an awful lot about it, but it's actually exactly the opposite of what you might think is happening in Iran is actually happening with a very large, I would say the majority of Iranians are reacting against Islam by emphasizing this sort of ethno-national nativism and all these sorts of themes, and particularly this idea, the Persian language is completely transformed. I learned Persian when I was young, and I can virtually not read the Persian newspapers now because they've just changed all the words. All the words that I knew are no longer, even sort of common greetings are no longer what I know as Persian. It's a completely different language. All the Arab words have been taken out and replaced with words that I struggle to cope with. And all of that has taken place within an Islamic government that you might think would actually strengthen the Arab language and the the connection with Islam and sort of the transnational Islamic identity, the supranational Islamic identity, but actually the opposite has happened.
Again, similarly, at the same time in Europe, we're seeing an increasing centrifugal force pulling, seemingly, the European community apart. After Brexit and the rise of Golden Dawn, Front National, Freedom Party, Pegida, I could go on and on about these different manifestations of a pronounced populist nationalism, which still nonetheless have that common core I identified present within them. Now, that they're not as pronouncedly far right as, for the most part, with the possible exception of the Golden Dawn, as the groups that I've described. But there is, and I think this relates back to that initial point, that what we're seeing is a reaction against our particular historical moment, a belated one, but cultural transformation takes time to take effect. But at least part of this is. And I'd be fascinated to work this through in that context of Iran, and you mentioned Zoroastrianism, because I was thinking, well, if what I'm saying holds true, there has to be some kind of spiritual component that begins to glue those cultural shreds and patches together, and the Zoroastrianism actually provides that. So it's fascinating to discover that that's been incorporated into that particular narrative.
Sorry, Major, I can see that our next presenter is trying to Skype me from Peru, so we have to... No, stay where you are, because I promised Susan very brief last question, so we'll just get there.
The Swedish scholar Matthias Gardell, in his book God in the Blood, or God is Blood, that book, he sees that there's a kind of divide between the old-fashioned American white racialism that's Christian, the Aryan nations, etc. And these guys are aging, and that youth is more excited about the pagan sort of white racialism, like in Sweden, and so on. And I was wondering if you found that kind of divide or that kind of pattern in your research. And when I was in Sweden, I actually went to an asatru ritual in the woods, and they explained to me that they're very much against this kind of exclusion of Jews, etc., and they welcome people from other countries, and they're not white racists and so on. And apparently there seems to be some kind of struggle in asatru between the people who are accepting.
Yeah, no, I mean that's something that I'm quite conscious of, and they have been very very careful to delineate themselves from the appropriation of their religion by the far right. And asatru are, I think, one of those examples of where that struggle I'm describing, that countering in spiritual context, is occurring. Mog Morgan, I think, has described, I don't know whether it actually saw the light of day, similar battle in the Temple of Set, or Satanism, to try to rid it of the far right elements that they saw as operating some kind of entryism to co-opt their beliefs for their own purposes. And in terms of continuities, discontinuities and continuities between the old guard and the new guard, I think that link, that bridge, is David Lane, because David Lane came out of that same generation as the old guard, the Christian identity, for instance, but through the Brotherhood was at once straightforwardly a terrorist, a white nationalist terrorist, but whilst in prison produced this great body of works in which he reinterpreted, in his phrase, Wotanism, and this is at least one, it's not the only, but it's one of the strands of that emergence of a particular reinvention of Nordic paganism for white nationalist purposes. And yeah, I mean, as you say quite rightly, and this is something that Sartre has fought against. So,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
thanks.
Okay, we're now